3, 2, 1. Happy New Year! And that, mon ami, is why one should never drink the California champagne. Anyway, another year has come and gone. There have been some great moments and some terrible moments for sure. That's true on a personal level, on a professional level, and on the world stage. Indeed, on the whole, I haven't been entirely satisfied with the previous 12 months, but despite all that, or perhaps partly because of it, we did get some great horror this year, both on screen and on the page. So that's our business today. As we mark the passing of 2022 and the beginning of what we can all hope to be a much better year, we're celebrating here on the Phobophile channel by counting down the top 5 horror books and top 5 horror movies of 2022. Very briefly, before we get to those lists, there's just a bit of bookkeeping to take care of. First of all, if you haven't read or seen any of the books or films on my list, you'll be able to find links to them down in the What's It. And because I participate in affiliate marketing programs, anything you purchase through those links can help support my work here on this channel. While we're on the subject of growing this channel, do be sure to make sure you've subscribed and turned on notifications so you don't miss any of the wonderful things I have planned for the new year. It's also helpful if you feed the YouTube algorithm by liking, sharing, leaving comments, and so forth. You have my sincere thanks in advance, both for doing all of those things and indeed for putting up with the fact that YouTube all but forces me to keep asking for them. Now, as for our best of the year list itself, I've selected 5 top horror novels and 5 top horror movies for this year. The rules for inclusion are fairly simple. They have to have come out in 2022. With films, that can be a bit fuzzy at times because maybe a movie had a festival screening last year, but made it to theaters or streaming services or DVD this year. In general, I'm comfortable with a fairly loose definition, so films will be included if they had a major release this year, regardless of whether that was technically speaking the first time anyone saw it or not. I've also been mindful to try to select a range of different kinds of books and movies for these lists, so even though everyone's tastes are a little bit different, there ought to be something for everyone. Finally, for both books and movies, I've selected a single top offering of the year, and the other 4 in each category are being presented in no particular order, just because I simply couldn't find a good way to rank order all of them. And of course, ranking just slightly below the top 5, I'm also going to include a small selection of honorable mentions. With all of that out of the way, let's get right to it, beginning with the top horror movies of 2022. Counting down to my top pick, the first one I've selected is actually a foreign film I haven't heard too much conversation about, and that's Hannah Bergholm's Finnish movie called Hatching. I don't want to spoil too much about any of these films because they're worth discovering for yourself, but the basic premise of Hatching is that a young girl finds a giant egg in the woods and she brings it home. When it hatches, the creature that comes out of it begins to morph into the girl's doppelganger. As I said, I haven't heard too much conversation about this one, but what I have heard mostly places this within the body horror subgenre, but I don't think that's right. Sure, there are some of those elements present here, but where the movie really shines is in its depiction of a young girl desperate to please her cold and social media obsessed mother. It's a commentary on the psychology of family in the age of Facebook and Instagram and TikTok. And it's a resounding indictment of the direction in which our image-obsessed societies are moving. To reduce such a rich story to merely the few gross-out moments in the movie seems to miss the point entirely. It's not because of the body horror elements that it makes it onto my list, but for the psychological horror elements. And in that regard, I can think of no better way to start our countdown than with Hatching. Next up is a bit of a cheat because I'm squeezing two films into a single ranking. And that might give away the game. Those are Ty West's films, X and its prequel, Pearl. Here's the thing. Both of these are great movies, but on their own, I'm not sure if either of them would quite have made it into my top 5. They might have been honorable mentions instead. This was a really good year for horror, and there are just a lot of contenders. But when you consider how remarkable a thing it is that both the original film and its prequel came out in the very same year, the combination of the two of them is good enough to warrant this recognition. The first film, X, is a great tribute to the grindhouse horror films of yesteryear. If you like those kinds of movies, you're going to love X, and I think it's a load of fun. Pearl is something entirely different. Though still starring Mia Goth in the lead as one of the two characters she portrayed in X, and though still a horror movie, it's quieter and maybe more of a psychological kind of horror rather than the gore fest that was X. So between the two, we're really getting it all. If X is in the style of something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, then Pearl is maybe more like Psycho. Both excellent, but in entirely different ways. And the ability of the cast and crew to tell such very different stories in such very different styles while maintaining continuity of both plot and character between the movies is incredible. While X really does have the gritty look of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Pearl not only has a different tone, but an entirely different look, treating us to a technicolor horror more reminiscent of The Wizard of Oz. In the end, I think I probably prefer X overall, but that's not to take anything away from Pearl either. Particularly right at the end when Mia Goth delivers, I kid you not, a nearly 8-minute long monologue that's one of the most remarkable pieces of acting I've seen, not only in years, but in decades. She really deserves the Oscar for that performance. But of course, the Oscars are the Oscars, and they're almost certain to snub the entire horror genre, adding to a growing list of offenses that mark their increasingly rapid decline into complete irrelevancy. But since I expect the Oscars won't get things right, at least we can do our small part here on the Phobophile channel to honor some excellent work and include X and Pearl together on our list of top 5 horror movies of 2022. The next one on my list is a surprise, even to me. A few months back, I watched a movie on Shudder, just on a whim, not really expecting much, and I was completely surprised by it. I'm referring to the found footage horror comedy movie Deadstream. It was pretty much entirely constructed by the husband and wife team Joseph and Vanessa Winter on what must have been a truly minuscule budget. The film follows a disgraced internet celebrity as he tries to redeem himself and rebuild his audience by live streaming a visit to a haunted house. Of course, things go about as well as we'd expect. Honestly, this movie has no right to be as good as it is. The lead character, also portrayed by Joseph Winter, should not be at all tolerable, much less likable. And yet, there's some magic in this movie that renders even such an annoying character as somewhat charming in his own twisted sort of way. What's particularly remarkable is that it manages to deliver not only some good laughs, but even some genuinely creepy moments. Most horror comedies tend to emphasize either the horror or the comedy at the expense of the other. But somehow, this little movie manages to capture both of them simultaneously, all while offering some meaningful commentary on internet culture, but without shoving its message down the viewers' throats like far too many other movies these days seem to do. I think there are two elements that really make it work so brilliantly. The first is Joseph Winter's performance as Sean, a character whose unrelenting obnoxiousness might prove challenging to other actors. And that's part of what's so brilliant, I think, because the character somehow manages to turn obnoxiousness into likability in a way that seemingly every YouTuber except yours truly and maybe a handful of others employs in a market where profitability seems to be a function of outrageousness. And then there's the cinematography itself. Every shot and every camera angle is justified as part of Sean's live stream setup. And though the film does not consist of merely a single take, it is shot in a way that the viewer experiences the story in real time, complete with realistic on-screen commentary from Sean's live audience, and without any jumps in time. That's quite an accomplishment indeed. Next up we have Orphan First Kill. Those of you who've been around this channel for a while know that I'm a fan of the original Orphan movie, and I even made a video commenting on its eerie parallels with a real-world case. When they announced that they were making a prequel starring the same actress, I was, let's say, a bit confused and a bit concerned. When Orphan came out, lead actress Isabel Fuhrman was a child. Now she's an adult. I had no idea how they were going to pull off a prequel under those circumstances. Plus, once you've seen Orphan, you know that the real power of the film is in its twist ending. It was hard to imagine how a prequel, or even a sequel, could recapture any of that once we already know what's going on. Well, I shouldn't have worried because First Kill manages to pull it all off almost flawlessly. With regard to the technical aspects, I was blown away by how well they handled making a grown adult look like a child. They used a combination of makeup, forced perspectives, body doubles, and they even had some of the other cast members wear giant boots to help create the requisite height differential. The result is that, yes, one can tell that the actress is older, but not in a way that's distracting from the movie in any substantial sort of way. Even more importantly, they managed to write a script that maintains complete continuity with the first film, even in fact offering some deeper explanations of some of that film's elements, while still somehow keeping the suspense alive and, miraculously, even delivering some surprises almost on par with the twist at the end of the first movie. I'm usually the first in line to complain about all the sequels, prequels, reboots, and remakes coming out of Hollywood these days. Lord knows we need some new and original ideas, and frankly, the subsequent offerings are almost never on par with the source material. Orphan First Kill manages to be the exception that proves the rule, demonstrating that it's possible, however rare, for filmmakers to give us a prequel that will leave us at least close to as satisfied as we were with the original. So those are in positions 2 through 5. Before we get to my number 1 pick for the best horror movie of 2022, let's consider a few honorable mentions. These are the films that might very well have made it onto my list, but somehow just got edged out by the ones I've already mentioned. Nevertheless, they are very much worth watching. First up, going back to our discussion regarding Deadstream of found footage movies about internet personalities, let's talk about Dashcam. There are a lot of comparisons to draw between the two movies. Both are about internet celebrities whose personalities may walk the line between charming and obnoxious. Both are found footage movies. Both even include on-screen commentary from the characters' live viewing audiences. But Deadstream just pulled it off a little bit better, and so that's why it was on my list, and Dashcam is an honorable mention. But that's not to say Dashcam isn't a good movie. It's a very good movie. It has some genuinely creepy moments, but while Deadstream managed to really feel like a real live stream, Dashcam was just a little sloppier in its cuts and joints between scenes. Even the lead characters are similar. Both of them are somewhat over-the-top and obnoxious personalities, but Deadstream seemed to hit the mark just a little bit better. That's actually somewhat strange when one realizes that in Dashcam, lead actress Annie Hardy is portraying not a fictional character, but a fictionalized version of herself. But her commentary on the film after its release suggests that the disconnect may have been the fault of director Rob Savage. The way Hardy tells the story is that the live footage she shot for the film was selectively edited to make her appear more obnoxious than in reality. I think there's an important distinction there. Joseph Winters' Sean is over the top, but he's not necessarily an asshole. Hardy's character in Dashcam is portrayed, at least according to Hardy's own account, as crossing that line in a way that doesn't mesh with reality. Admittedly, that is taking Hardy's word for it, and Rob Savage might have a different perspective, but I honestly think it's a believable explanation because Hardy's character, even as portrayed in the film, as over the top as it all was, still manages to convey a certain endearing charm. So I think there's maybe more to her character than what actually made the final cut. At the end of the day, even though it has some flaws and wasn't ultimately quite as good as its counterpart, Dashcam is still an excellent watch, and you should check it out if you haven't seen it yet. Our next honorable mention is Barbarian. This film starts off when a woman arrives to the house she's rented, only to discover it's been simultaneously rented by another person. One immediately wonders whether he's playing some nefarious game, or whether something else is going on, and as the plot progresses, the horror starts to ramp up and goes in some unpredictable directions. As I sat in the theater watching it, I was just about ready to put it on my best of the year list. The film follows a very clear 3-act structure, and the first act is truly brilliant. The second act is still good, but slips just a little bit. Unfortunately, it slips a lot more in the final act, leaving us with something that, while still good and still worth watching, isn't nearly what it could and should have been. And I can tell you exactly what happened. Writer and director Zach Crager described it himself. While writing the film, he became concerned that his plot was too predictable, so he just injected some random plot twists. These twists certainly do diminish the film's predictability, but they also detract from its logical coherence, so I'm not convinced that was the right decision. Nevertheless, its brilliant opening, combined with stellar acting all around and some great creepy scenes throughout, certainly earn it an honorable mention. Another of the films a lot of people have been talking about is Smile, and it also deserves an honorable mention. I suspect most of you have seen it by now, but in case you haven't, it's the story of a woman somehow infected by an evil entity that's following her around and manifests as a smiling face. Encounters with this entity are almost universally lethal. It's got a lot of elements of It Follows or The Ring, and those who haven't liked the film have called it a ripoff of those movies, perhaps forgetting that even those films are indeed part of a longer horror lineage. And to be sure, Smile isn't a perfect movie, but it does deliver some great scares, including some jump scares that are actually effective, and a couple wonderful quiet moments wherein the viewer realizes something is about to go horribly wrong just a few precious seconds before the characters on screen do. The scene at the birthday party comes readily to mind for those of you who've seen it. I don't honestly have all that much to complain about. While Smile didn't outperform some of the other movies on my list, I'm still more than happy to recommend it. On the other hand, if I were instead making a list of the top horror movie advertising campaigns of the year, Smile would definitely top that list. They paid actors to go to public events like sporting matches and stand around smiling creepily at strangers. That is genius. Let's talk about a movie now that is perhaps more thriller than horror, and that's The Menu, a film in which a bunch of rich people visit an outrageously expensive restaurant on a secluded island for a meal prepared by an acclaimed chef, only to realize the chef has planned something a little more violent in place of an ordinary dinner. Starring Anya Taylor-Joy, who apparently can do no wrong when it comes to horror movies these days, as one of the diners, and Ralph Fiennes as the chef, the film is certainly impressively cast and brilliantly performed. And of course, I love any movie centered around food. It's honestly a really good thriller with some comedic commentary on the absurdity of some of the excesses enjoyed by people who have, let's say, more dollars than sense. Though admittedly, there is something bitterly ironic about Hollywood people making fun of the kinds of excesses that, frankly, their own communities invented. I shouldn't be surprised because Hollywood is really good at seeing their own faults in everyone except for themselves. Nevertheless, it's a lot of fun to watch and combines a lot of the things I enjoy: ironic humor, a tense plot, and good food. Our next honorable mention is The Sadness, the Taiwanese neo-zombie movie that set the internet all a-Twitter because of its intense brutality. And yeah, it's brutal, and that alone might make it worth watching for those of us who enjoy that sort of thing, though no, it's not the most brutal movie ever made. But there's also some subtext hidden within the film and its title. I've commented on it before when reviewing the movie as part of my horror pack offerings, but to summarize in brief, the zombies are always seen to be crying. Combined with the title, that's led some people, myself included, to think that what's really driving the film is the idea that the normal, decent people trapped inside of these sort of proto-zombies are still conscious and they're able to witness their own involuntary acts of extreme violence. And that's the kind of haunting idea that makes this film really unforgettable. Next, we have a film called Watcher, and importantly, we're talking about Watcher, a thriller about a woman who thinks she's being watched and stalked by a man who lives in the apartment across the street. We are not talking about The Watcher, the Netflix series from Ryan Murphy that took a true story about a mysterious and slightly threatening letter and turned it into an overwrought amalgamation of too many plots and subplots to sustain itself. Watcher is actually an interesting, intense film that, while far from being original, does a really good job of exploring the boundary between vigilance and paranoia. Another film that almost made it to my top of the year list was What Josiah Saw, a brutally grim, slow burn of a film about family trauma that's unrelenting in its bleakness. Which of course means it's the kind of movie I really like, because as much as we all enjoy something lighthearted from time to time, the real meat of one's literary or cinematic diet probably ought to be the depressing stuff that gives you something to think about. This film tells the story of the Graham children, and it's almost a collection of short films, as each child gets his or her own chapter, and each is as depressing as the last. But it's not clear from the start how they're connected until we get to the final act. Not a lot of people have been talking about this one, and that's a real shame. I suspect its slow pacing might be scaring some audiences away, which is a double shame because it's precisely because of that slow pacing that we get the depth of characterization that makes the film's final revelation all the more horrifying. And then there's Violent Night. I was honestly tempted to put this on my best of the year list, but the thing of it is, it's more of an action thriller than a horror movie, and it just wouldn't seem right for it to edge out an actual horror movie, especially in a year that's been so rich with great horror. But even though Christmas Day has passed and we're nearing the end of Christmastide, I still highly recommend it for anyone who hasn't seen it yet. Sometimes you just need to watch Santa Claus beat the crap out of some thugs, and if that's what you need to reinvigorate your own joyous spirit, then God bless Violent Night for giving us all exactly what we didn't know we needed. And while we're on the topic of Christmas movies, our final honorable mention for this year is The Mean One, starring David Howard Thornton of Art the Clown fame as the Mean One. That is, he plays the Grinch, except they never use the word Grinch to avoid potential copyright issues. And that's one of the truly brilliant things about the film. The wordplay, ostensibly just to avoid intellectual property litigation, ends up being so persistent and so brilliant that it becomes almost like another character in the movie. Even the bottle of whiskey one character drinks bears a pun on the name of Dr. Seuss, and that's the kind of attention to detail I love, and which no one else really seems to be noticing or talking about in connection to The Mean One. The film itself is the kind of low-budget cheese with an overabundance of heart we all know and love. The only thing I really didn't like about it was an overuse of CGI blood effects, but even those sort of grew on me by the end as a constant reminder of exactly how seriously we're supposed to take the movie. And that brings us to the best of the best. With the honorable mentions out of the way, it's time to reveal my number one pick for the best horror movie of 2022. And that film is, perhaps unsurprisingly to many of you, Terrifier 2, written and directed by Damien Leone, and starring David Howard Thornton as Art the Clown and Lauren Lavera as Sienna Shaw. The original Terrifier has become something of a cult classic, and I certainly love it. Art the Clown is perhaps the quintessential evil clown, dethroning even such iconic characters as Pennywise, who I still love, but even I have to admit it's time to make room for a new king. But as much as I loved Terrifier, the sequel by far surpasses the original, both in terms of plot and brutality. Art is nastier than ever, but also arguably funnier than ever, and that's key to the success of this movie. Though it's not a horror comedy, Art is an extremely funny character. He's a true clown. He just also happens to enjoy dismembering people, and even those scenes are flavored with hints of his trademark humor. Though it's certainly not the most extreme horror movie I've ever seen, it is remarkable in that it's easily the most extreme movie I've seen in a wide theatrical release, and that's another part of the movie's magic. On a budget of just a couple $100,000, and despite being thankfully unrated by the censorship-happy goons at the Motion Picture Association, Terrifier 2 managed to take the box office by storm. Many of us have read about what happened when such horror classics as The Exorcist, still one of the greatest of all time, played in the theaters. Those of us too young to have seen it in person are still blown away by the stories of people fainting or having heart attacks in the movie theaters. Well, we only needed to wait for Terrifier 2, because the mass movie-going audience, perhaps not quite prepared for the brutality of indie horror, went and saw it, and some of them did indeed faint or vomit in the theaters. No one did in any of the several screenings I personally saw, but I did hear a lot of groans of discomfort. Some theaters even handed out vomit bags with the purchase of a ticket. Not only is Terrifier 2 a great film, and it is, but it was the horror event of the year, and both of those factors make it an easy pick for the best horror movie of 2022. I'm all the more pleased that it left a few questions unanswered, so we can eagerly await Terrifier 3 and hope the series keeps getting even better as it progresses. With apologies for the pun for anyone who's seen the film, I have the feeling we've seen just the tip of what Art the Clown has in store for us. And special congratulations to David Howard Thornton for starring not only in my top pick, but also in one of the honorable mentions. That's a rare achievement for a single year. Of course, that means it's time to move on and discuss the best horror books of 2022. I have to begin with a little bit of a disclaimer. I haven't read even close to every book that came out this year. The same is true of movies, but it's even more true of books. Most of my reading this year was focused on older works, so I had a smaller pool of candidates from which to draw. So if I've missed your favorite, that could be why. However, be that as it may, I nevertheless did find a good selection of books to recommend. Once again, beginning with ranks 2 through 5 in no particular order, let's get right to them. First, I want to mention The Pallbearers Club by Paul Tremblay. The Pallbearers Club of the title was a group of kids in high school who volunteered as pallbearers for poorly attended funerals. The novel is written in the form of a memoir of the group's founder as he comes to terms with the idea that one of his fellow members might be something other than what she seemed to be. But what's interesting about this book is that it features competing narratives throughout. We have the main character, Art, not Art the Clown, but Art Barbara, writing his memoir, and then we also have the other character, Mercy, writing annotations in the margins to correct his story. These present wildly different perspectives on the events that shape the novel. I went into this expecting a horror novel. It's not exactly that. I mean, it is a horror novel, but it's even more substantially a work of metafiction and a sort of commentary on the power of our stories to shape the way we perceive our lives. I'll admit I didn't initially like the sort of experimental format. As a rule, I find experimental fiction to be pretentious and nearly unreadable. But in this case, the experimentation was done lightly enough and with strong enough purpose that it actually results, by the end, in something remarkably thought-provoking. Next, we have Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes, a sci-fi horror novel about not just any ghost ship, but a ghost spaceship. Taking a traditional ghost ship story and setting it in space is the sort of thing that can either revitalize a subgenre or seem completely cheesy. Well, Dead Silence comes a lot closer to the former than the latter because it possesses all the elements I love about nautical horror, the unforgiving environment, the sense of isolation, the claustrophobia, and so forth, and sets them in a futuristic world. I'll admit that about halfway through, it took a turn that, while it completely caught me by surprise, it left me also a bit nervous about the rest of the book. It was the kind of twist that seemed like it was going to undermine everything that had come before. But, despite a few awkward chapters about halfway through, it managed to avoid most of those pitfalls, and to keep progressing toward an ending that was rather different than what I expected at the start, but nevertheless satisfying on the whole. Honestly, the worst we can say is that one or two of the characters are maybe a little bit flat, but those aren't even the main characters, who are actually quite an interesting bunch of people on the whole. There's really a lot to like about this book. Author S.A. Barnes has written a number of books under a different name, but as far as I know, Dead Silence was her debut adult horror novel, so it's all the more impressive that it makes it onto the best of the year list. Next we have Road of Bones by Christopher Golden. With this book, I came for the setting, but ended up staying for the story. The novel follows a group of documentarians driving along the Kolyma Highway, a 1,200-mile stretch of road in Siberia. It's a real road and home to some real horrifying history. The road itself was built using forced labor from Stalin's gulags. As the political prisoners died performing manual labor in the unforgiving conditions, their bodies were incorporated into the pavement because the Soviets didn't want to bother digging graves in the permafrost. It's estimated that somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million people died building that road, and their remains are located beneath or near the road's surface. Tell me that isn't the perfect place to set a horror novel. Well, the novel itself doesn't make as much use of the setting as I expected. I was thinking it was going to be something like a ghost story about the Gulag prisoners or something like that. However, just because it subverted my expectations doesn't mean it isn't still a good story. It sets us off to a little bit of a slow start, giving us time to really get to know the characters, which is exactly what I love in a good horror novel, and then it treats us to some genuinely creepy and exciting scenes as it builds toward its climax. It would be a very good book anyway, but its hauntingly historic setting in Siberia catapults it right onto my list of the best of the year. Next, we have Echo by Thomas Olde Hoefelt, a Dutch author that achieved international success with his book Hex. Echo is the second of his works to be translated for an English-reading audience, and a lot of fans of Hex were looking forward to it with great eagerness. And I have to say, I don't think many of them were disappointed. It's a very different kind of book, but the author's mastery of the horror genre is on full display from the very beginning. The story, told from multiple perspectives, introduces us to a man who narrowly survived a mountaineering accident. His companion was not so fortunate. But as the story progresses, we realize that he might have brought some kind of evil from the mountain back with him. And we end up with a fascinating tale of how obsessions, much like this character's obsession with mountain climbing, can take control of our lives in horrifying ways. One of the things I really liked is that, though it certainly borrows from some established tropes of the genre, this novel is unlike anything else I've read. I love zombies and ghosts and vampires and werewolves as much as the next guy, but it's nice to read a book on occasion that delivers an evil a little less familiar to those of us who've dedicated our lives to the genre, and Echo does a great job of it. So that's positions 2 through 5. As I mentioned, those aren't in any particular order. We could put Road of Bones ahead of Echo, or Echo ahead of Road of Bones. I couldn't decide how to order any of those. However, I have reserved the number 1 ranking for my very favorite book of the year, but before I get to that, I do have a few honorable mentions from the literary world to offer you as well. First is a book I read just about a week ago now because it seemed perfect for the Christmas season, and that's Lucky Girl by M. Rickert. It came in my December Nightworms package, and it was a perfect book for a single sitting read next to the fireplace on Christmas night. It didn't quite make the best of the year list because its success depends, I think, largely on the holiday season, but for that season it was just what Krampus ordered. In fact, it's even marketed as a Krampus story, though as we read it, we realize Krampus is treated metaphorically in this case rather than literally. Regardless, if you're looking for a creepy Yuletide horror story, Lucky Girl is worth considering. And then there's Sundial by Catriona Ward. She's probably better known for her book The Last House on Needless Street, but Sundial is also well worth a read. It starts off feeling like it's going to be a familiar sort of hybrid between ghost story and family drama. But while those elements are present throughout, it quickly differentiates itself into, well, something else entirely. A lot of the book's action centers on flashbacks, and the reader can be forgiven for wondering how the flashbacks will connect to the present-day story, so there are some moments of confusion in the middle of the book, but if you trust the author, you'll ultimately be treated to an excellent read that does indeed manage to successfully tie everything together in the end. And the ending itself will catch you off guard. Perhaps not entirely, as savvy genre readers will certainly pick up on at least some of what's happening, but there's at least one revelation late in the story that caught even me off guard, and I'm pretty hard to surprise when it comes to horror. Another honorable mention goes to The Vessel, a novella by Adam L.G. Neville, probably best known for The Ritual, which was adapted as a film in 2017 by the Imaginarium and distributed internationally by Netflix. Given the author's prominence, I was pretty excited to see what The Vessel had to offer, and the first thing I noticed was that Neville's writing is top-notch. The story is deep and creepy, and the prose is engaging. Indeed, the book was very much on track for inclusion on my Best of the Year list, though I feel like the ending was a bit of a disappointment, and so it ended up getting edged out by some of the other books I've mentioned. Even still, that doesn't make it a terrible book by any stretch of the imagination, and even though I didn't care for the ending, I still think it's a great read. And our final honorable mention goes to The Children on the Hill by Jennifer McMahon. I'd read some of the author's work before. Her The Winter People was a truly excellent and creepy story told across 2 different timelines. This new book follows a similar structure. Part of the book centers on some children growing up in the shade of a mental hospital in the home of their psychiatrist grandmother, and a patient she's brought into the home to raise alongside her own grandchildren, who she's raising after the deaths of their parents. And the other half of the book is set in modern day and tells the story of a woman chasing monsters for her podcast and television series on the subject. As the story progresses, it becomes clear how these timelines and stories are interconnected, and we're treated to a story that's been compared productively to Frankenstein. Though I hasten to point out that while it shares some themes with Mary Shelley's classic, it's still an entirely original work and not a mere retelling. I'm not going to say I liked it quite as much as The Winter People, because that book would be pretty hard to top, but it's still an excellent read and I highly recommend it. And that brings us to the moment we've all been waiting for. My selection for the title of Best Horror Book of 2022. That honor belongs to Things Left Behind by Brian Keene and Mary Sangiovanni. This is a collection of short stories. 2 of them are co-written by both authors, and the remainder alternate between works by Keene and Sangiovanni. Though they've been a couple for more than a decade now, this marks their first book-length collaboration, and it's a triumph. Despite their very different literary voices and styles, these 2 are among the masters of the genre. Both authors have had works appear separately on my best of the year lists in the past, so it's probably little surprise that their combined talents prove a force to be reckoned with. Because this is a collection of short stories, there are, of course, some standout works of genius, as well as a few that didn't impress quite as much. But what's particularly remarkable about this collection is that there are surprisingly few in that latter category, and none that seemed like mere filler without any merit at all. I can't remember the last time I read a collection whose quality ranged not from the bad to the good, nor even from the mediocre to the great, but from the quite good to the genius. Things Left Behind was published as a limited edition paperback by Thunderstorm Books, and I feel a little bit bad about that because I don't know how easy it's going to be for anyone to find a copy. But if you can find one, snatch it up, because despite my reservations regarding putting a limited edition at the top of my list, this really is the best horror book, at least of those I read, published in 2022. And there we have it, my 5 best horror books and 5 best horror movies of 2022, along with more than a few honorable mentions. Overall, I'd say this was a good year for horror, and now I'm looking forward to, let us hope, an even better 2023. By all means, please do let me know in the comments whether you agree or disagree with my selections. We all have different tastes, of course, and Lord knows there were plenty of great books and films that could easily have made my list, but if I mentioned everything I enjoyed, we'd be here all day. So I necessarily had to commit some rather painful omissions. Do also make sure you've subscribed and have rung the notification bell. I have a lot of great things planned for 2023 here on this channel, and in my creepy, spooky life in general, and you won't want to miss out on any of it. We'll get things started off with my countdown of some of the most anticipated horror in the year ahead, and after that, well, you're just going to have to stick around and find out what else I'm cooking up. Allow me to leave you with the words of Benjamin Franklin, who said, "Be at war with your vices, at peace with your neighbors, and let every new year find you a better man." With that, have a happy new year, and as always, take care and stay scared.